Welcome back, everyone. Our second speaker is Dr. Joe Roberts, who is an assistant professor and extension specialist in turfgrass pathology and nematology at Clemson University's PD Research and Education Center in Florence, South Carolina. Joe is a native of North Carolina and has been working in the turfgrass industry for over 15 years. He has undergraduate degrees from North Carolina State University, a Master's of Science degree from Rutgers University, and a PhD in plant pathology from North Carolina State University. Joe joined the Plant and Environmental Sciences Department at Clemson in September of 2019. His research and extension programs focus on innovative methods to reduce turfgrass loss from disease and nematodes. Welcome, Joe. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction and happy to be here to discuss some of our work over the last several years, looking mainly at diseases, but I am going to touch a little bit at the end on nematode issues that are impacting areas of the landscape, particularly here in the Southeast region. But we're going to start with diseases. And just to give you all an overview, I wanted to touch base on some of the topics that we're going to hit. First and foremost, I think that when we're thinking about turfgrass diseases, it's important to consider the overall disease development and looking at ways that diseases develop and try to pinpoint areas where we can develop management tools to impact disease overall. From there, we're going to move into talking about some specific foliar diseases that we see more commonly on warm season turf, but also touch on some cool seasons as well. And then from there, we're going to move into some root disease issues that we see in addition. But overall, we're going to be looking at symptoms. As we can see here we have some spots showing up on leaf, and then looking at more stand symptoms, moving into plant or leaf symptoms. And then we will also touch on some of the microscopic characteristics that we can look at and trying to identify some of these disease issues as they occur on turfgrass. We'll be offering some chances for everyone to chime in throughout the presentation, mainly just because I want to get a sense of people's opinion on the appearance of certain symptoms that we're going to go over. So look for those opportunities as we chime in or as they develop, and hopefully we can either unmute ourselves or try to type in some answers into the chat. But just to begin, getting back to that idea or introduction to plant disease in general, when we think about plant disease, there are three different components that we consider necessary to occur when we observe disease. So we need these three components occurring over time. We need an environment that's conducive to disease. We need a host that is susceptible, and we need a pathogen present in that system. And so again, if you knock out one side of this triangle, you're not going to have any disease. And we need all three of these to occur over time. And in the essence of time being a factor, some people do consider this to be more of the disease pyramid, with the time factor being more in that three-dimensional sector. But again, when we're thinking about ways to manage disease, if we can target particular areas of this disease triangle, we may be able to limit the overall amount of disease. And when we think about diseases in the disease triangle, I'm sure if you've been to disease talk before, you've seen the disease triangle or some derivation of this. But when we're thinking about these components, this also reigns true when it comes to weeds as well. So here we have the weeds triangle. Again, we need a favorable environment, we need a susceptible crop, and we need that weed seed bank. But when we're talking about diseases, I like to look at it more from the sides instead of the corners. So you can see, again, different variations of the disease or weed triangle. But if we're looking back at the disease triangle in general, and we're looking at ways to target methods to reduce the overall amount of disease, here you can see we have an alteration of the disease triangle, with this host side being a little bit shorter. And that's where we may be able to employ a resistant or more adapted host to a particular region. And that's going to allow that host to grow better and maybe outcompete some of the pathogens that might be present when you still have a conducive environment and a set of pathogens present. Comparing this to the previous disease triangle that I could have shown, you would notice that this one is actually smaller. So we're reducing that total amount of disease by employing a more improved host species or even improved host cultivar within species. Because When we're thinking about warm season grasses, Bermuda grass being a common warm season turf grown here in the Southeast, there are a lot of newer Bermuda grass cultivars within the species that offer certain advantages over what we say drought tolerance or other growing conditions that could, again, favor that host development and, again, impart that host resistance to outcompete the pathogen should we have an environment that's conducive. Now, the host isn't the only area where we can adjust to have an effect. We can do what we can to impact the environment as well. And that may be by imparting practices that may enhance the microclimate to favor the host over certain pathogens. A lot of the foliar pathogens that we talk about are more favored under very wet or extended leaf wetness periods. So if we can alter irrigation timing to reduce overall leaf wetness period, we may lessen that environmental component and, again, reduce that overall amount of disease. So in this case, you could say that we have an improved host. We have imparted some cultural practices to impact that environment. We still have the pathogen there, but we're reducing that overall amount of disease in general. Because, again, a lot of the pathogens that we're going to discuss today, they're really always around. These pathogens are what we would consider endemic to our region, and they sit around at low levels year round, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it's only when that host susceptibility and environment converge with the pathogen to where we see those symptoms of disease. So if we can, again, limit factors of the environment or limit factors of the host, we can reduce that overall amount of disease, even in the presence of certain pathogen populations. So you may be thinking, how can we do that? How can we impact certain practices so that we can create a less favorable environment for disease to occur, or impact the host in a positive way so that we can make that host less susceptible? And there are many considerations. And in thinking about some of these cultural considerations, I think first and foremost is developing a plan for your particular site. Every site is different. And if you're managing different lawns or high value landscapes, even within the same area, you can have different microclimates that can play a role in disease development. Now, if we have a plan for those particular sites, we can adjust on as needed throughout the year to hopefully prevent, or in some cases, try to cure diseases that they develop. Second would be budget. Every site has a different budget, and that's going to impact the tools that you all have as available as managers to reduce or prevent certain diseases as they occur. First and foremost, after you have a plan and a budget, establishment is really going to go a long way. Now, if you're thinking about establishing a new site, first and foremost, we definitely recommend soil testing. That'll give you a snapshot of where you stand in terms of particular nutrients that may be limited for your particular site. Being able to adjust those levels prior to planting is only going to help that plant to thrive in the conditions that you have. And again, when a plant is thriving, it's going to be less susceptible to a lot of the pathogens that we so commonly see. Soil preparation is critical after you've done some testing, breaking up any compaction that you might have, adding certain amendments pre-plant if you have that ability. Those again are going to go a long way. And I'll talk about some amendments that have been shown to reduce certain pests of turf as we get into the seminar here. And then again, playing on that species cultivar selection. If you can establish a new or improved species or cultivar, again, that's just going to thrive in that environment more so and reduce the potential for certain pests to develop. Now, once this site is established, or if you don't have the ability to establish a new site, maintenance can also go a long way. So irrigation timing. Oftentimes we like to see irrigation running in the evening. Homeowners typically come home, flip on the irrigation, and it is a nice soothing moment as we're going into the evening periods. But this is the worst time to irrigate, because what it does is it wets that leaf surface prior to dew formation, and then the dew forms overnight and you're extending that leaf wetness period, where we typically recommend irrigating in the early morning hours to knock down the dew off of the plant and reduce those leaf wetness periods. Mowing can also be a factor. Utilizing clean and sharp mowing equipment can be advantageous in creating a wound that heals quicker. That's going to create less of a time for pathogens to enter the plant. Some pathogens that we do see require wounds to enter. Others can directly penetrate the plant. But if we're utilizing mowing equipment that's clean and sharp, we can get a faster healing. Fertilization, timing of fertilization, amount of fertilization can go a long way. So making sure that you're applying fertilizer to support plant growth throughout the year and avoid heavy fertilization during periods of the year where that turf may be going into dormancy or not growing a whole lot. And then top dressing with certain amendments can also be helpful. We also see top dressing with sand, very helpful in certain sports turf and golf course situations. But when we're thinking about landscape top dressing, I'm really referring more to certain amendments that could be supplying fertility and or certain carbon sources that could impact the soil structure and soil physical and chemical properties. So if we're thinking about fertilizer in general, I often get questions about timing of application and how that can impact certain diseases. And with warm season grasses being a primary component of the Southeast, I like to look at the growth pattern of the turf and thinking about how that can be utilized in structuring a yearly fertility program. And when we're thinking about warm season growth, we just have this one single growth curve. And if we compare that to cool season turf, it has somewhat of a bimodal growth curve. But notice here, as we get into spring months, spring is upon us here in the Southeast. It seems after this weekend, I believe the first day of spring is Sunday. We're going to start getting into warmer temperatures, more consistent warm temperatures, and starting to see more green up out of our warm season turf. As we get into summer, we get the most growth out of our warm season turf, and we also get the most root growth out of our warm season turf. And then as we get into the fall periods, we start to slow down in terms of our growth. Now, if we're trying to target our fertility applications, we want to, again, apply the fertilizer to support that growth pattern. So you want to start your fertilizer applications in the spring. You can carry them through the summer, but you want to avoid high rates of soluble fertility, particularly as we get into these fall months. And one reason for that is because when we typically see diseases that occur on warm season turf, we see them here in the fall and we see them here in the spring. Typically in the summer, we're typically growing out of disease symptoms because the turf is more actively growing. It's better able to defend itself. The shoulder seasons are when we typically see diseases of warm season turf. Now, if we can get out the gate and get some fertility down, we may be able to start that growth process early, initiate that plant defense early. But if we're applying a high amount of soluble fertility in the fall, what we're really doing is, particularly in the falls that we've had in more recent years, where conditions may be somewhat conducive still to top growth of warm season turf, we're going to be favoring more top growth in lieu of root growth. And especially when we talk about some of the root diseases that I'm going to discuss later on, we really want to make sure that we're driving our roots down and getting as much root production as we can get out of our system, because that's going to benefit highly in terms of disease and nematode management. So again, you want to avoid applying high fertility rates during periods of reduced growth, as they can encourage disease. Again, thinking about this, you can consider this growth pattern, and even with recent years, some may argue that that time of year where we may be limited may be reducing because we are seeing more extended summer conditions in the fall. But again, definitely avoid these high soluble rates as we get into the fall and cooler periods as these warm season grasses are going into dormancy. When we're thinking about fertility, obviously we have a lot of different choices in fertility, but one of the other things that we can consider is the use of some of these organic amendments. Now, not only do they provide fertility in some cases, sometimes a long-lasting, sustainable source of fertility, they can also impact what we consider the turf microbiome or the soil microbial community. So here we have some examples of compost, improving turf quality, reducing disease in this case. So here you have untreated areas where there's no disease occurring, whereas the areas that were treated with compost Having a higher amount of fertility, having possibly an enhanced plant defense activation from certain microbes that could be stimulating that activity. There are a lot of benefits to utilizing certain composts, and we're actually doing some work now with certain biochars and compost amendments. So trying to look for potential benefits there. But again, we're thinking about general suppression. Certain composts can promote what we consider a healthy habitat. And this can not only impact physical properties. So if you're adding in solid amendments, you're going to reduce the chance of compaction. This can impact chemical properties by applying fertility. These carbon substrates can enhance CECs of soils, and they can also bring in certain beneficial microbes or stimulate certain beneficial microbes that may be imparting a certain reduction in plant or turf pest activity. These can be solid, and some of these actually, we now have foliarly applied amendments. And then basically what they are is compost teas or vermicompost teas that can be foliarly applied, and in some cases may provide some benefits. I typically see more benefits from solid applied amendments as opposed to foliar, but I do think that there are some new technologies coming out, and we're interested in doing some more work in that in the future. Now, if we're thinking about composts in general, these can enhance native soil populations. And as far as a general recommendation, if you can do about 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet, this has been shown to suppress certain diseases like dollar spot, brown patch, Pythium root rot. But again, control is definitely going to vary based off of the target disease, the type of compost, and the degree of which that material was composted. So always be mindful of your source. Look for an analysis with a compost source if you're trying to acquire that. I have seen issues with certain composts having high salt contents that can be damaging to turf. So definitely make sure that you have an analysis with the source that you're using, or have some experience using that source if you're trying to compost yourself. Because again, while we do see a lot of benefits, there can be some negatives as well. Now, again, if we're thinking about just amendments in general, whether it be composts or biochars or other type substances, these can improve soil physical properties. Like I had mentioned, they can, when incorporated into the soil, they can reduce the potential for compaction. They can also provide a long-lasting source of fertility. They may potentially be altering the microbiome, and we see an overall response in plant health. And again, we like to attribute this plant health to, one, the turf is growing better, so it's better able to defend itself. But also, if we're altering certain beneficial microbes and colonizing that plant, we're crowding out pathogens that may be coming into contact with the turf. And again, just reducing the overall pest activity. Now, that's a general introduction. I just wanted to touch on plant disease in general and looking at some of those cultural practices and how they can be utilized to reduce the potential for turf pests. But now I wanted to move into some specific ideas and in terms of diseases. I think we'll touch on the questions at the end. Is that correct, Bodie? Or do you want me to touch on them as they're coming in?
However you'd like to handle them, we typically handle them at the end. But if you feel like this would be, however you want to do it.
So for segueing, I think we'll probably just go ahead and touch on compost. What is an ideal analysis for a compost for home lawns? So again, we've utilized a lot in our research. I've only been here in the Southeast or back in the Southeast for the last year and a half. But when I was in the Maryland area, we utilized a biosolid compost from Baltimore composting facility. It was a 1-1-1 analysis, and that would be 1% nitrogen, 1% phosphite, 1% potash. And we found really good results out of it. One of the things that we had issues with our work was it was considered a finely meshed compost, but we definitely still saw that it would sit on top of the turf. So making sure that you can incorporate that into the canopy if you're using it as a top dressing. If you're incorporating it into the soil pre-planting, you can get by with a little bit more larger chunks. But we've used, again, the 1-1-1 composting facility. But again, just looking for that nutrient content, trying to get an idea of what's in there. Again, look for the EC if you can get that information, because we've seen some negative impacts with salts as well. Now, moving back into thinking about turf diseases in general, I think it's important to know how to spot certain symptoms. And this is really critical when you're moving from site to site and looking at potential development of disease. And this is where I think that we can divide this up. So looking at stand symptoms and then looking at individual plant symptoms. And some of the diseases that we work with have some characteristics that can allow you to form somewhat of a close diagnosis at the site. So if we're thinking about stand symptoms, these would be what we observe when we're standing about 6 feet from the area. So this could be a patch or a spot. In this case, occurring in the turf, it could be a ring. Here we have a green ring or a ring of mushrooms that we associate with fairy ring. And then if we were looking at plant symptoms, we may see individual lesions occurring on the leaf blade. So here we have brown patch occurring on tall fescue, and these irregularly shaped lesions on tall fescue in conjunction with a brown patch occurring as a stand really is a pretty clear diagnostic feature of that disease. We can also have blights. Here we have a blighting of perennial ryegrass. If we're thinking about this, it's important to know how to spot certain symptoms. And this is where I'd like to open it up to the group here and see if anyone could tell me what either one of these diseases are or what symptoms are occurring, because they are two different things. And I just want to get a sense if anyone has any ideas on what's going on. I'll give you a hint. This right here is actually St. Augustine, and this right here is tall fescue. So does anyone have any guesses as to what we're seeing here? Feel free to chat here in the chat box. I'll open it up for a few seconds to see if we have any answers. It looks like we're not really seeing much. That's okay. There'll be more chances here, but does anyone think that this is a disease?
There is something in the chat.
I'm only seeing there we go. Chat here. I was looking at Q&A. All right. So we got rust and we've got root rot on the right. Left looks like rust, maybe leaf spot. All right. So here on the left, this is actually slime mold. From a landscape standpoint, you may get questions about slime mold from homeowners or concerned patrons at facilities that you manage, but this is actually not a disease. This is occurring on St. Augustine, but slime molds can occur on cool season, warm season, and typically they show up after heavy rains, but know that this is not killing the plant. What you're seeing here on the right is actually a leaf spot, but this is gray leaf spot. They have this characteristic flagging that we associate with gray leaf spot. And then you can see the individual leaf spots that we associate with gray leaf spot as well. So again, knowing how to spot certain symptoms, knowing that this case right here, this is a growth on the turf. This is not really a disease, whereas this is obviously taking down turf and this will advance further. So slime mold, gray leaf spot. I got one more here for you. Just opening this up. These are actually both this is tall fescue and this is tall fescue. But does anyone know what either one of these is? So on the left and the right, just trying to get a sense of what people are thinking in terms of activity. Obviously, this is really taking down turf. Okay, looks like Pythium. Would you say Pythium is on the left or the right? Or both? Okay, so Ben said that Pythium is on the left. We'll leave this open for another second. Pythium on the left, mycelium on the right. Got melting out. All right, so on the left here, we have Pythium blight or Pythium melting out. This is a new seeding of tall fescue. Very wet conditions observed in the mid-Atlantic in the fall of 2018. And here you can see very clear crashing of the turf, really severe outbreak of Pythium. With Pythium, you can also get this cottony, grayish white mycelium. But again, if you look at these individual leaf blades, you can see that they're just really going down quickly, and Pythium's known to act very quickly. Here on the left, it's a little bit different, and I put these together because sometimes I'll get calls about this occurring. But notice here, can you see in between them what we consider the mycelium here? Still looks like a lot of healthy turf. What this is actually is spider webs. And I have been to some sites over the years where the spiders have been so rampant that literally the entire lawn was covered in what looked like Pythium mycelium. And really, the main way that we figured this out is I would get the landscapers to send me samples, and I wouldn't see anything, and I wouldn't see anything. And finally, went back, and we could see that all the spiders had hatched, and there were just spiders everywhere. But again, looking for decaying turf in this case is really the turf is somewhat healthy. Here, we can obviously see very declining turf, and then this severe blighting, melting out that we associate with Pythium blight. So those are just some examples, just thinking about ways to spot different symptoms and signs. In the case of the last one, we have signs of Pythium with that mycelium. And I see someone did mention spider in the chat there. So great job. But as we move into the next part of the presentation here, I want to talk about some specific foliar diseases that really are significant here in the Southeast that I've observed over the years. So one being leaf spot disease. So leaf spot is caused by different pathogens, actually. We have Bipolaris species, we have Drosclera species. We actually have some newer classifications of Turvularia that can cause leaf spots. But leaf spots can occur both on cool season and warm season grasses. And typically where we are here in Florence, we pretty much grow 100% warm season turf. We do see a fair bit of leaf spot. We see a good bit of it on Bermuda grass, but we can also see it on some other warm season grasses as well. I had a sample come in last year with leaf spot on centipede. But when we're thinking about leaf spot, really when these occur is when we have slow growing turf. So remember, I said that this can also occur on cool season, but we typically see leaf spots in cool season hosts during the warm weather periods when that turf is really slowing down in terms of its development. So again, we already mentioned leaf wetness periods as a factor in terms of foliar disease. So high humidity is going to extend that leaf wetness period, and that's going to impact the development of this on cool season hosts. Now, if we're thinking about warm season hosts, we typically see leaf spots in the spring and the fall. So during the cool, wet weather periods, again, high humidity playing a factor, but we're getting into a time of the year now where we can see leaf spots develop. We typically see more leaf spot in the fall here where I am in South Carolina, but we will probably see some develop on Bermuda grass here in the coming month or so. Definitely something to be mindful of. Here you can see some of the thinning out that we associate with leaf spot. If you were to look closer at the plant, so this would be the stand symptom. Here we have the plant symptoms, and you can see these individual spots on the leaf. And if you have a high-powered microscope, you could actually look at the leaf tissue under the microscope, and you'll see what we consider these cigar-shaped spores, Bipolaris, associated with the spots occurring on that leaf tissue. Now, if we're thinking about leaf spot management, there are things to consider. One, leaf spot is worse under low fertility and really high fertility. So typically in terms of my work, I've always seen it more on the low fertility side, but excessive rate can stimulate disease. And if we're thinking about Bermuda grass, 1 pound per growing month is typically a rule of thumb. So anywhere from 4, 6, 7 pounds a year is going to stimulate Bermuda grass growth and hopefully prevent leaf spot development. And if you are considering managing leaf spots with fungicides, the QOIs are effective. Heritage or azoxystrobin, Disarm, Insignia are fame. We have certain contact fungicides like Daconil and Secure. And even the SDHIs can be effective, like Ballista, or the active in that is penthioperide. So you got a number of choices in terms of leaf spots. Definitely recommend rotating through these. But to give you an example of how certain practices can impact disease, this is actually a trial from our work at Maryland in 2017. And one thing I can tell you going into this trial is this area was very low in fertility early on, mainly for the whole year prior to development of this trial. So here what we have is our non-treated control. We have urea as a check, we have Banner Max, we have Eagle, and we have Armada. Now, in Maryland, you are limited in terms of soluble fertility to 0.7 pounds in per 1,000 square feet in a single application. And what we're looking at here across the graph is the area under disease progress curve. So this would be the total amount of disease observed across the season for these particular treatments. And they were replicated 4 times. Our treatments were initiated mid to late May and applied every 28 days in 2 gallons per 1,000 square feet. So one of the things that really stands out is, one, we had a good amount of disease. So our area to disease progress curve, we have a lot of disease here, this being our highest amount, and that A being that statistical factor. And if we compare it to our treatments here, you can see that our statistical difference here, our highest is the non-treated control. And then all of these treatments were significantly lower in terms of disease compared to this not treated control. But if you look here, one thing that does stand out is that urea was one of our best treatments. And this is where I like to think about what was the most limiting going into this trial, and it was fertility. So we're getting a better growth response, we're getting a better plant response, and we're better able to defend off those pathogens and grow out of those symptoms. Whereas these did not receive any extra fertility. And while they were able to reduce disease, I would argue that these fungicides would probably work even better if we would have incorporated a certain amount of fertility. So again, assessing your fertility practices first and foremost can be important in managing leaf spot, and fungicides can be effective if needed. So that's just one example of how fertility can impact a specific disease. Now, we talk about leaf spot, but one other thing that we need to think about is also gray leaf spot. And they are 2 different diseases. Gray leaf spot is caused by Pericularia griseae. And when we're thinking about this, is also a disease of cool and warm season turf. Now, here in the Southeast, St. Augustine grass, very susceptible to gray leaf spot. Here, we actually have St. Augustine grass in my backyard, and you can see the severe leaf spot occurring here. And if you were to look at these individual spots under the scope, you would see these water balloon shaped spores associated with the gray leaf spot pathogen. Now, gray leaf spot is more severe on young stands, more likely to take it down, especially when it comes to cool season turf. And one of the things that we have seen in more recent years further north is that gray leaf spot is really impacting 100% stands of tall fescue, and really causing some significant problems there. But if we're thinking about management of gray leaf spot, first and foremost, if we have a cool season, we do have some resistant cultivars available. But we do need to look at additional research, looking at the other species. High rates of soluble fertility can encourage a lot of top growth, encourage a lot of density, and that can impact the disease negatively. And then also limiting leaf wetness. Again, that early warning irrigation to reduce that leaf wetness period can go a long way to reducing the potential for gray leaf spot. Now, we do have multiple fungicide chemistries available for gray leaf spot. The QOIs can be effective, DMIs, and benzimidazole. We do have cases of resistance with certain QOIs, so I would avoid reliance on these. And really, when we're thinking about management, and if 3336 or thiophanate methyl can be very effective. Now, the one caveat with the use of thiophanate methyl when it comes to landscapes is that the use rates are different. And maximum use rate for thiophanate methyl in residential areas is actually 2 ounces per 1,000 square feet, as opposed to 4 to 6 on golf course turf. And that's really where we see the most benefits for thiophanate methyl in reducing gray leaf spots. So definitely be mindful of the rates and where you're applying these, but there are some choices, some better than others, in terms of managing gray leaf spot. Large patch is also another foliar issue that we see in warm season turf. This is caused by Rhizoctonia solani, similar to the fungus that causes brown patch on cool season turf, which I already mentioned. And as far as grass is impacted, centipede grass can get large patch very severely. Seashore paspalum, we have a lot on zoysia grass here right outside the facility. St. Augustine grass as well. Bermuda grass can get it, but it doesn't get it as severe as some of these other warm season species. But when we're thinking about large patch development, it's important to recognize when we should be treating for this issue. Here you can see we have patches. This is occurring in the fall of 2020. And here, looking under the microscope, you can see this characteristic right angle branching associated with the fungus that causes this issue. But we can see symptoms develop in the fall, and in some cases, we see symptoms develop only in the spring. But when we're looking at the biology of this fungus, we do know that it becomes active in the fall when soil temperatures start to dip below 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're looking for methods to prevent, especially utilizing certain fungicides, you want to target your fungicide applications when soil temperatures are getting down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Here you can see spring of 2020, very severe symptoms occurring on a newer area of zoysia. But again, if left unchecked, this can definitely cause some significant problems. Just to give you a sense of some of our work over the last year, this is fall fungicide applications for large patch on centipede. Here you can see our non-treated check, and this is percent large patch on October 26th and November 16th. Here you can see we had about 16, 17% in our non-treated check, and then about almost 30% in our non-treated check in mid-November. And here you can see basically all of our fungicides really having a nice effect in reducing the overall symptoms. And definitely here we have Armada, Headway G, Asprop G, and Pillar G. All of these are granular formulations and really providing some substantial reductions. And we're looking forward to examining this in the spring as well to see how this develops. This just gives you a sense of some of that development. Here's our non-treated. You can see a lot of these declining areas here. And then just looking at all three of those, very good reduction. And just switching out that Headway with this Asprop G generic, same rate, very good reduction in comparison to the untreated. Now, we talked about foliar diseases, and I know we've got about 15 minutes here. I wanted to touch on some root disease issues as well. Again, moving back into how to spot symptoms. This is just one other example where we could look at the potential for root disease symptoms. And I wanted to get a sense on everyone's take here to see if they could spot what symptoms we would see here. So here we have a centipede St. Augustine lawn. Here we have a zoysia grass area. Does anyone know what might be occurring here? Does anyone see any specific patches or spots in either one of these? Oh, the pictures aren't showing up?
I see them.
Yeah, possibly is okay, there we go. Might be a connection issue. So in this case, here on the left, I want to point out that notice that what we're seeing here is like a really large area of declining turf. This is actually weeds colonizing declining turf areas. And then we have some dead areas here. Whereas here we have more of a defined patch and discoloration associated with what we consider possible disease. And to give you a sense of what we're looking at here, this is actually an area where a blow-up pool was left too long. And the picture's not so great, but this can kill turf just as easily, even better than a disease, and really take down. Whereas this is actually a warm season decline. And if you were to look at this picture on the right here, under the microscope, you would see what we consider lobed hypopodia occurring on the stolons and in sheaths of this plant. And that's very characteristic with Gamenomyces infection. So again, just knowing how to spot symptoms can really go a long way. And this is just another example of that. Now, if we're thinking about some major root diseases of warm season turf, spring dead spot is definitely the number one root disease of Bermuda grass in the southeast. Spring dead spot is caused by multiple species of what we consider Ophius sphaerella. So we have Ophius sphaerella cori, we have Ophius sphaerella herpatrica, and Nemari. And here in the southeast, we typically see more cori. You may see some herpatrica. I haven't seen any Nemari since I have been here in the southeast, but it's not to say that it's not out there. Now, if you were to look at spring dead spot, very characteristic name, dead spots of turf showing up in the spring. If you were to look at the roots here, you can see some of these black plaques occurring on the stolons and on the roots compared to a healthy root system here. And again, these areas are very slow to recover. They get weed colonization. And can be very detrimental to the aesthetics of any landscape or high value turf area. Now, here is a very severe outbreak of spring dead spot occurring on a Bermuda grass area in the mid-Atlantic. And here you can see the large depressions. And if we were to consider how these develop, again, similar to large patch, this fungus or these fungi become active in the fall when soil temperatures drop below 70 degrees. And what happens is as that turf is going into dormancy, you have fungi that are colonizing the Bermuda grass roots, eating away at that root system. And then once winter conditions set in, you will get winter kill. And then these spots are essentially winter killed areas that show up in the spring. So if we're thinking about ways to combat spring dead spot, basically anything that we can do to promote rooting is going to help reduce any sort of root disease. Because one, that's going to help those roots to thrive and compete pathogens that may be lurking in the root system. And it also may be just supporting, if we do get a little bit of infection, we may still have more of a root system to reduce the potential for winter kill that we associate with spring dead spot infection. Now, if we're thinking about conditions, again, any factor that reduces rooting. One is high soil pH can play a role, but compaction, excessive thatch, saturated soils, all of these are contributors to spring dead spot. Because it is related to winter kill, you could also consider factors that reduce winter hardiness, such as high soluble in applications in late fall, low potassium, and again, saturated soil conditions. And if we're looking at some of the older cultivars, they may be more susceptible, but we do have some newer cultivars of cold tolerant Bermuda grass in Tahoma 31, Latitude 36, Patriot, and others. And the use of these may offer some resistance in terms of spring dead spot development. Now, that's not to say that these do not get spring dead spot. I've seen plenty of spring dead spot on Latitude. I have not seen it yet on Tahoma 31. But I'm definitely, these can occur. It's just, it occurs slightly less because they are more cold tolerant and persist better through some of the rough winters that we have. Now, if we're thinking about ways to combat this via a fungicide, one of the things that's important is application method. Now, with this being a root disease, we want to make sure that we target that fungicide down into the root system. Now, this would be different than what we're thinking about with our leaf spots. Now, leaf spots, these typically occur in the foliage, and that's where we can get away with applying a fungicide in 1 to 2 gallons. Whereas if we were looking at a disease of the crown, we might be able to get away in 2 to 3 gallons. But if we're considering a root disease like spring dead spot, we want to apply in either 5 gallons per 1,000 square feet, or we can apply in 1 to 2 gallons and then water in immediately following that application with at least 1/8 of an inch of irrigation. Because again, we want to drive that product down into the roots where it's going to be most active against those pests that cause the issue. Now, if we're looking at some options for fungicide control of spring dead spot, we do have some. We have some newer products that have come to market in recent years. This is some work from a spring dead spot occurring on a Bermuda grass fairway in 2018. And what you're looking at here is Cabuto, which is a SDHI called isofetamide. We have Tekin, which is the combination of Cabuto and tebuconazole. We have Ballista, which is Penthiopyra, another SDHI. Torque is tebuconazole by itself. Heritage is azoxystrobin. Mirage is also tebuconazole. And then we have our non-treated check. Now, one thing to note here, we're looking at percent spring dead spot on 2 different rating dates in the spring of 2018. And if we're thinking about the application, if we're looking at these symptoms in spring of 2018, these applications actually went out in fall of 2017. And I can tell you that these applications were applied in 2017, probably late September and late October. We typically apply 2 times, 28 days apart. Now, if we're thinking about this from a landscape standpoint, tebuconazole is not labeled for landscape or residential areas. So those are out. But notice here that even with varying rates of the Cabuto as well as the Ballista, we're getting a substantial reduction in spring dead spot compared to that non-treated check. So especially on that May 25th, we're getting a lot of healing We did see more in the early rating, but as the spring season came in, very quick healing and a large reduction in spring dead spot in association with these SDHI applications in the previous fall. Moving into one other disease here that I wanted to discuss is fairy rings, and mainly there are tons of different fairy ring causal agents. We have the agaricus, lycoperdons, marasmius, lots of different fungi that can cause fairy ring. But when we're thinking about fairy rings in general, we have three different categories. We have the dead rings, which we consider type 1. We have green rings, which we consider type 2. And in this case, we actually have a dead ring and a type 3 ring of mushrooms occurring in the same. Again, these can have varying impacts on the aesthetics as well as just thinking about the overall management of an area. But if we're looking at ways to combat fairy ring, type 1 being more of a dead ring, these are related to hydrophobic conditions created by that fungus. And these are more severe in droughty conditions. So if you can break up that soil through aerification and apply the right amount of irrigation, that can go a long way. Wetting agents can also help in alleviating some of these symptoms or preventing them from occurring. Type 2 rings, these are those green rings. These are more severe under low fertility. And sometimes fertility can be used to mask symptoms or allow the turf to grow out of those type 2 rings. And we can also apply iron to mask symptoms, as iron can make turf greener. And again, in this case, wetting agents can help. As far as type 3 rings, these are more just nuisance symptoms, and mushrooms can simply be mown off the surface. Now, moving into the last topic here, just wanted to touch on nematodes as a significant issue. When we're thinking about nematodes, these are tiny roundworms. I know that Dr. Koppenhofer had already mentioned some work on entomopathogenic nematodes. But again, when we're thinking about turf, they can also be pathogens of turf as well. And we have different categories. This is root knot nematode. This is lance nematode. This is ring nematode. And in terms of populations, they can be detrimental to turfgrass, even in the landscape. These typically colonize more sandier soils, but I have seen them outside of this region of the soil triangle. But typically we see nematodes in high sand content root zones. And when we see nematode damage, we typically associate high levels of nematode feeding with an environmental stress such as drought or high heat. And that's when we'll see yellowing, browning, thinning out, and sometimes weeds that develop in an area. But again, when we're thinking about damage, I typically associate environmental stress as a critical factor in the development of nematode issues. Now, I do want to touch on sampling methods. Just thinking about this, a diagnostic sample versus a routine sampling. And here we have an examples from University of Florida Extension. And essentially here we have dead grass, we have declining grass, and we have healthy grass. And if we're looking at sampling for nematodes, we want to pull from that leading edge where that turf is actively declining, because nematodes aren't going to stay where there's dead turf. They need to move into living turf, and that's where you're going to get the best snapshot. If you don't have that and you're just looking for an idea of your population, just doing a random set of subsamples that can be combined and sent in for nematode analysis can give you a snapshot of where you stand. And if you should be concerned with the potential for damage, should it be coupled with an environmental stress. Here we have an example of an area that's declining. Here you can see this is severely declined, and then we have an intermediate area. And these would be good areas for sampling, thinking about targeting in that declining turf. Now, if we're looking at cultural controls to limit damage, again, with stress being a factor, minimizing plant stress can really go a long way. Proper irrigation, proper fertilization. You can do practices that improve rooting, aeration, and then again, incorporation of organic amendments may assist. And some recent work out of the University of Florida has shown that certain compost sources can be effective in reducing sting nematode in this case. What we're looking at here on the left-hand side is percent green cover across a multi-year study. And here we have a sand control in the black line. Red line is conventional compost amended. and blue line is Command Compost amended. And what you can see here on multiple dates where the Command Compost is statistically better than the sand control, and even some cases the conventional compost is no different. There are plenty of days where there are no differences, but there are several where we're actually seeing an enhance in percent green cover. And what they found is that essentially amending the soil prior to planting suppressed sting nematode populations, but the top dressing did not really impact those populations as much as enhancing growth. But again, something to think about when you're looking at a lot of tools to manage high value landscapes. There are some nematicide options. However, for landscapes, we are a little bit more limited. But again, it is important to recognize that there are some nematicide options for managing nematodes. Fluopyram being very effective against sting, as I had mentioned. We also have fluindsulfone, Bacillus firmus, as well as some newer biological heat killer Burkholderia species that we're doing some work with now. And again, just thinking about these being in the roots, still got to apply in a high gallonage or apply in 1 to 2 gallons and water in with 1/8 of an inch of irrigation. So I know I moved through that relatively quickly and we're getting towards the end of our time here, but I did want to thank everyone for their time and feel free to utilize my contact information should you have any questions in the future. And I can take any questions that you might have now.
Thank you, Joe. There were a couple of questions that came in, and we really are at the end of our time. So, but go ahead and answer those. And I think you'll be probably handling some via email.
Yeah, that's fine. Command Compost is a commercially produced compost. That's something that can be purchased in a lot of different areas. Whereas when we think about conventional composts, these may be more regionally produced. I had mentioned some work that we did with Orgro compost that's only available in the Baltimore area, even in Pennsylvania, Command being a specific brand. And then here in the Southwest Georgia, getting killed with large patch in residential yards that I take care of. Recently, weather has been crazy. Most people cannot afford to be on a fungicide program spraying every 28 days. What, if anything, would you recommend this time of year and in the fall? Just answer when you have time at the end. So one of the things that we've seen with large patch in earlier years, we typically saw that 2 applications in the fall could really be helpful. With the more extended seasons that we've had in recent years in the Southeast, we're seeing spring applications as a necessity, sometimes multiple spring applications. If it's a continued issue, obviously looking at those fertility components to see if that's a factor, looking at irrigation. Typically we see large patch more severe in irrigated areas, trying to adjust those cultural management practices as necessary, but we do need to do more work on large patch. And I'm trying to actually combine with a couple of my colleagues at other universities here in the Southeast to start a large patch research project. Hopefully we'll have some more information in the future, particularly looking at some of the compost sources and how they might be impacting beneficial microbes. But right now, in terms of fungicide programs, I understand the 28 days and limited applications, but more recent years, we've needed even more 28-day applications into the spring to effectively manage large patch. Feel free to email me. I think those are the last 2 questions, Bodie, and sorry that I ran us right up there till the end. I got a little long-winded, but hopefully if people have questions, they can contact me via Twitter or emails.
There's one more that came in, and that was in the chat.
Okay. So
That'll be the last one. Actually, there are 2. So do you recommend not applying potash during the fall months as a winterizer fertilizer?
Oh, no. So there can be definitely some advantages to potash. You know, that's increased K as far as winter hardiness. Typically, when we're talking about fertility, I was really referring more to nitrogen fertility that's going to stimulate a lot of top growth in the fall months. Applying potash when you are limited is definitely going to be the most ideal, but it's not that I'm saying not recommending that one in the fall. So I think that's all that I'm seeing here.
That's in the chat. Someone popped in the Q&A. I guess we go back and forth.
Okay.
Ideal compost.
Ideal compost. Again, That's a loaded question. There are a lot of different sources and how they're produced. I think again, look at the analysis, look at some of the attributes with the potential for just basically amending the soil if you're able to incorporate it, and try to avoid anything that's going to have a really high EC content because that can be damaging to your turf. But again, there's a lot of good sources out there, and there are a lot of ways that they're produced that still can be beneficial. So, sorry,
All
trying to
right.
answer that in a relatively quick fashion.
Oh, I know. It's a very loaded question, and yeah, we can talk for hours here.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Joe and Albert. We really learned a lot through these 2 hours. Hopefully, people will reach out if they had additional questions. I know that this can go on, but we have to get going. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for our speakers, and we will see you in about a month and a half.